want to start off by saying that at the time the following events took place, I had been ill for several months. That bit of information will be significant later in the story. I had been working another overnight shift at my security job. The night itself had been relatively quiet and fairly uneventful, and I was just looking forward to going home and trying to get some sleep. The sun was just starting to come up, and I decided to make another sweep of the grounds before unlocking the facility for the morning. As I exited the building, I noticed a thin Asian male leaning against the glass of the front entrance. I had been working this job for several months, and he didn't look like anyone I recognized. As is common when I exited the building, I made sure that the auto-lock door behind me closed tightly. This is something I do quite often because I want to make sure that the door does indeed lock when I exit it. All of the boaters themselves have passkeys to these doors, and at first I thought maybe the guy sitting there might have been a boater. But I noticed that as soon as I exited the building, he seemed to be staring at me through the corner of his eyes. I walked a good distance away and then turned around to stare back at him, and I realized he couldn't have possibly been a boater, because if he had been, he would have just entered the building with his key card. If it would have been a case where he had forgotten it or maybe lost it, odds are he would have asked me if I could let him in. But he didn't. I continued walking a little bit further before stopping and turning around again, and when I did, I noticed he was still sitting there. I watched him for a few more moments, and I noticed he appeared to be watching me as well. He tried not to make it very obvious, most of the time just staring at the concrete in front of his feet, and occasionally stealing a glance out of the corner of his eye, and slightly turning his head towards my direction. I just kind of brushed it off as him waiting for somebody, and I continued walking. When I got to the boat launch area, I realized I forgot my parking ticket book, and headed back to the facility to grab it. When I got back to the main doors, that same person was still sitting there leaning up against the glass, sitting in the exact same position he was when I left. I tried not to pay any attention to him and just swiped my badge to get inside the building. As I pulled the door shut behind me, again, I noticed he was looking up at me. He had this look on his face like he wanted to say something to me, or maybe ask me a question. But he didn't. He just kept staring at me. I shrugged it off and went inside, and grabbed my ticket book from the store. When I came back out of the building, as I had done before, I pushed the door shut behind me. And once again this guy was staring at me. It looked like he wanted to get inside the building but was waiting for the right moment to get in. He had been watching me long enough to realize that the door was locked and that you needed a key card to get in. I went back about my business and continued my patrol of the lot. When I got back to the main building, I went over to the pool area to start unlocking the showers and uncover everything for the morning. As I walked past the main building, I noticed that the guy was gone. I figured he probably found a ride or something, or whoever he was waiting for had probably come to meet with him, or whatever. At least that's what I told myself. I headed over to the pool area and started unlocking everything, which took me about 15 or 20 minutes. When that was done, I circled around the building to the boardwalk. The side of the building that faces the boardwalk has two large metal gates in front of it. These are key-locked just like the front entrance of the building, and only boaters and security can access them. As I approached the first metal gate and reached to unlock it, I noticed that that man was standing inside the gate. I thought maybe someone had let him in, but he was just standing there by himself. I was watching him for a few moments, and I saw him approach the rear door of the building. The door was locked, and he tried pulling on it several times before giving up. Again, I just tried to convince myself that he had been let in by someone else and he was just waiting for them, or maybe he was trying to get inside to use the restroom or something. I wasn't really sure. He then walked down the stairs and started approaching the boat docks, and I saw him reach for the gate and try to pull on it before realizing it was locked. At this point, I realized with absolute certainty that this guy was trespassing and that he had probably snuck in the gate area somehow. This wasn't the first time I've caught somebody doing this. I had only been on the job for a couple of weeks when I threw out my first trespasser. Most of the time I simply have to tell them that they're trespassing and that they need to leave, or I'm going to call the police, and that usually works. I went inside the gate and approached him, and I asked him what he was doing there and how he got in. He tried telling me that he had come through the first gate, and I asked to see his key card. He then said something along the lines of he wasn't a boater and that he didn't have one. I then pressed him a little further and asked how he got inside the gate. He then admitted that he had scaled the gate to get inside, and then said he was just there waiting for somebody. I asked him to give me their name and a slip number, and then something in his demeanor seemed to change. He went from looking me in the eye when speaking, to just staring at the ground. He also appeared to be squinting and smiling, and then he started mumbling something to himself. I asked him again to give me a name and a slip number, and tell me who he was waiting for. He then slowly raised his head and looked at me. His expression didn't change, he still had that strange smile on his face. He told me that he was there meeting the boss. I figured he was lying to me. He was just trying to bluff me. The boss of the facility is a male, so I figured I could probably catch him in a lie, and asked him to give me her name. Once again, he went back to this sort of strange mumbling to himself. He started throwing out names that I didn't recognize, and then I called him out for lying and informed him that the boss of the facility was actually a man, and that there's no way he could possibly know him. I then informed him that he was trespassing and that I was going to call the police. He just kind of smiled at me. I don't mean he looked like he was happy. I mean it was one of those disturbing Joker kind of smiles. The kind where you can see that there are lights on inside this person's head, but nobody's home. I pulled up my cell phone and dialed 911 and told him that I had a trespasser on the property. While I was standing there talking to the dispatcher, I noticed that he started digging in his pockets with both hands. In security, as well as law enforcement, it's a common practice to ask somebody that you're interviewing not to put their hands in their pocket. The reason for this is that you don't know what they're carrying. They might have a gun or something, so you always ask them to keep their hands out of their pocket and at their sides. You always want their hands to be lower than yours, just in case they throw a punch or something like that. I immediately asked him to take his hands out of his pocket slowly, and that it was for my safety as well as his. I watched as he slowly took his left hand out of his pocket and showed his palm to me, as if to say, "Hey, there's nothing in my pocket. It's fine." I continued talking to the dispatcher and trying to give her a description of the guy, and trying my best to describe where at the facility we were standing, so that the police could find us easier when they arrived. At this point while I'm talking to her, his right hand was still inside his jacket pocket. I want to say I wasn't thinking much of it, but it was kind of bothering me. He slowly started removing it, and like an idiot, I glanced away for just a fraction of a second. This was something I was going to soon regret. As I slowly glanced back at him, his right hand was now fully removed from his jacket pocket, but his hand wasn't empty. He was now wielding a large kitchen knife, and he was less than a foot away from me. Despite having worked private security for such a long time, I had made several amateur mistakes in this moment. Mistake number 1. You always observe and report. You try to avoid any sort of physical altercation whenever you can, and whenever in doubt, you always involve the police first before approaching. My second mistake was entering that gated area and not giving myself enough room from this guy. I had gotten way too complacent and made way too many assumptions about him and just how dangerous this situation could be if it escalated. My third mistake was looking away. I should have never done that. I had now given this guy a perfect opportunity to stab me if he wanted to, and in those milliseconds that followed, my brain was rapid firing all the possible scenarios and outcomes that could take place in the next few seconds. I want to state that I have a very extensive background in martial arts. It's something I've been doing since I was a kid. But you need to forget about anything you've ever seen in a Hollywood movie when it comes to disarming somebody with a knife. It's Hollywood. It's make-believe. There is no magic disarm technique that works 100% of the time. There is no kicking the knife out of the guy's hand and him running away in terror. The only thing you can hope to do is go for the hand that has the blade, and try your best to control the weapon so you don't get stabbed. With law enforcement, You're taught that you have to have a minimum distance of 21 feet when you have a firearm and the person has a knife drawn on you. That's the only way you can take them down. And I didn't have a firearm. I was also way closer than 21 feet. As I stated in the very beginning of this story, I had been extremely ill for several months. I had been having problems with my balance and coordination, and I was extremely sick. I had also lost about 15 pounds. I knew there was no way I could physically fight this guy and win. I started frantically screaming to the 911 dispatcher that he had a knife and that I needed police there immediately. The whole time he had his knife in his hand, he didn't break eye contact with me. He just kept that sick, disgusting smile on his face. And again, he continued mumbling to himself. I knew that no matter what move I made next, it was going to be extremely risky, but I had to do something. If I didn't, there was a high probability that I was going to be killed. The only thing I could think of doing was trying to bluff this guy out. I figured if I showed any weakness, he would capitalize on that, and he would stab me. The only thing I could think of doing in that moment was snapping out my extendable baton and raising it in the air and shouting at him as aggressively and forcefully as I could. I shouted repeatedly for him to drop the knife, raising my baton over my head and stepping forward towards him. Again, something extremely risky to do, and I don't advise anybody ever try anything this stupid ever. He still kept that gross smile on his face. He didn't even flinch. And after a moment, he slowly opened his right hand and let the blade slide out of it. As it landed on the ground in front of me, I immediately kicked it out of the way and told him to get to his knees and put his hands behind his head. I made him turn around and lean his head up against the gate so his body was in a stressed position. That way, if he did try to move, he would lose his balance and it would give me a little bit of an edge. I kept frantically screaming at the 911 dispatcher that police had to be there immediately and that I needed this guy taken away. It was then that I could hear him laughing. He kept turning his head to look at me while the phone call continued. It would be another 10 minutes before police would arrive, and during that entire 10-minute wait, the guy just kept turning his head and smiling at me multiple times. On a few occasions, he would even start lowering his hands and reaching for his pockets again. Which leads me to my next mistake. I never patted him down or had him remove his jacket, and I didn't search him. When the police did arrive and put him in the back of the car, I noticed that he was staring at me the whole time, almost like he was trying to memorize what my face looked like. I felt absolutely sick to my stomach, and I opted not to go to work that night. The next morning I called the police and I asked what happened with that guy and what the results were. And this is where things get really messed up. They couldn't really find much of a criminal background on him, and so they decided not to arrest him. What did he get charged with exactly? Trespassing. No mention of the knife in the incident report. The cop said to me, "Lots of people carry knives." I reiterated that this guy was carrying a kitchen knife and that this was unacceptable. But they told me that since he didn't have much of a criminal history that they weren't going to pursue it. All this guy got was a ticket, a fine, probably less than $50, and he was told not to come back on the property again. The date that incident took place? July 13th, 2018. It was a Friday. 2 days later, we actually lost the account. And while it did suck to be jobless for a while and have to wait to be reassigned, it did give me some comfort and relief, because it meant that this guy wasn't going to be seeing my face for a while. As I mentioned before, he was free to go. He could have come back to that property any time, and he had certainly got a good look at my face. He would have easily recognized me, and since I was quite ill, who knows? Maybe this guy would try to launch some sort of sneak attack or bring some friends. I'm not really sure. There is one more thing about this whole situation that bothers me. Why was this guy trying to get inside the building? Why did he have that knife with him? And who exactly was he intending to use it on?